Welcome back to GLBC Connections. A few years ago, my family took what we have widely regarded as our favorite vacation. We went out to see the mountains, the Rocky Mountains. We traveled out to Denver. When I got out there, as I like to do, I struck up a conversation while we were waiting for our rental car to come, and I said to the kid who was standing there with us as we waited, he was doing our paperwork, I said, you're from around here and we're not. I said, if there were some place you would tell people to visit, where would you go? And he said, you know all the common spots. He said, what you really should do is go visit St. Mary's Glacier. And so we did that. And I had to tell you, St. Mary's Glacier is the middle of no place. St. Mary's Glacier, there's not a paved parking spot. It's just a little spot of dirt that you park on. There's nothing on the way to St. Mary's Glacier. There's nothing there. There's no, water. There's nothing to eat. Whatever you're going to do at St. Mary's Glacier, whatever you want to eat or drink, you better have brought it with you. That is a long drive and then hike in the middle of nowhere to nowhere. But it was great. We really enjoyed it. I'd never seen anything quite so beautiful and actually wished we'd spent a little more time there. My point is this: there are still a few places left in the world that you can go where there's nothing to eat, but there's not many. We're not used to that. Not used to the idea that you can't just go to the grocery store, go to McDonald's, find something to eat somewhere, somehow. But that was not true in Jesus' day. And in Jesus' day, they could get into the middle of nowhere and they would not have any means of food. And we see this in Mark chapter 8. This comes to a head. We see a feeding story. This will be a familiar story. I just want to point out a few things as we read it. This is Mark chapter 8, verse 1. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples. And he said to them, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place that is wilderness, desert area, can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Well, how many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. And the point to this is they are in the middle of no place and they have so little food that it's basically inconsequential. It's such a small amount, it doesn't even really matter. And Jesus sees all this and Jesus has compassion. And I think that speaks to who Jesus is a little bit. Jesus sees people in need and he has compassion and does what it takes to solve that need, as we'll see in a moment. The disciples, on the other hand, they have a bit of blindness. Even though they've already been through a feeding miracle, they've already seen this happen once before. We saw it in Mark chapter 6. Jesus is perfectly capable of taking what little food there is and spreading it out. But the disciples ask a profound question. Where in this wilderness, this remote place, can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Well, that's a question that's on its surface about the physical location and the physical situation of the crowd. They're out in the middle of nowhere. But I actually think it's a much deeper question. It's a question about their spiritual life, the spiritual life of the crowd, and the spiritual life of the disciples. Both wilderness and bread have strong spiritual components, ideas behind them. To be in the wilderness, as Israel was in the wilderness, as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. To be in the wilderness is to be in a place of danger, a place where sustenance is not available. And in the Old Testament, we learn that God provides the bread. And so I do think there's a spiritual component to this question. Where in the wilderness do we get bread? Where in this terrible place do we get what we need for life? That is, in the end, I think, a spiritual question, one that we need to ask ourselves. We live in a wilderness even today, not a food wilderness. We have plenty of food. That's not our problem. We live in a spiritual wilderness. We live in a world where the things of God are really kind of ignored. In fact, I was thinking about and reading a little bit about the Charlie Brown Christmas special that was done in 1964. And what's striking about it, even today, is the strong spiritual component that it has, the pointing to Jesus Christ as the meaning of Christmas. You never see that today. We live in a spiritual wilderness. And I think sometimes as Christians, we don't realize that we live in a spiritual wilderness. And so we're often destitute and asking the same question the disciples had. Where in this wilderness do we get anything to eat? Where in this spiritual wilderness of modern day America do we get our fill? How can we be satisfied? The central question, how can we be satisfied, is one that was true in Mark chapter 8 2,000 years ago, and one that's true today. How indeed can we be satisfied? We have more than enough food. That's not our problem. We have roofs over our head, plenty of social services. Most people, not everybody, but most people really are not in any sort of physical danger today. Obviously, there are some. But we still live in a spiritual wilderness. The question is, where then do we find spiritual bread? This, I think, is the point of Mark chapter 8. And we see the story continue. Jesus told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 people were present. In the end, the disciples ask what I think is a spiritual question. Where in the wilderness do we get bread? In the end, we find the answer is Jesus. Jesus provides the bread, both the physical bread for the people in Mark chapter 8, and Mark's larger point, the spiritual bread for the people of God. Jesus is life. The presence of God is life. I want us just to take a couple minutes to reflect on our own lives and think about where we try to find spiritual life in the midst of the wilderness. Are we really looking to Jesus, or do we turn to other things? Do we turn on our phones? Do we turn on our televisions? Do we go, watch sports, or go out to eat, or go to movies? Where are we trying to satisfy ourselves? If the answer is anything other than Jesus, then we're lost like the people, the crowd in the wilderness of Mark 8. Hungry, destitute, unable to find our way. But with Jesus, he will provide. He is capable of providing. He has the authority to provide. I hope you turn to Jesus, to him and him alone, to see him for who he is, the provider of every need, of all the spiritual bread that we need, the provider of our spiritual life, Jesus. Thanks for joining us today. Glad you're with us.